Welcome to the Sleepy Historian. Tonight, we drift back to the year 1692, to a small Puritan town where shadows grew longer and whispers turned into fear. This is the story of the Salem witch trials. The snow falls thick and silent over Salem village this January night, each flake catching what little moonlight filters through the heavy clouds above. The wind carries no sound save its own mournful song through the bare branches of ancient oaks that have watched over this land since long before any European foot touched New England soil. In the distance, the dark mass of the forest presses against the edges of civilization, like a living thing, patient and eternal, holding secrets that the Puritan settlers dare not contemplate in their evening prayers. Behind the frost-etched windows of the Reverend Samuel Paris parsonage, a small fire crackles in the kitchen hearth, casting dancing shadows across wooden walls weathered by countless New England winters. The house creaks softly with the settling cold, each timber speaking in the ancient language of wood and nail, beam and board. Here, in this modest dwelling that serves as both home and symbol of spiritual authority in Salem village, two young girls huddle close to the warmth, their faces illuminated by the golden glow of burning logs. Betty Paris sits motionless as carved stone, her 9-year-old frame wrapped in a woolen shawl that her mother wove during the long autumn evenings when the harvest was done and winter's approach could be felt in every gust of wind. Her pale skin seems almost translucent in the firelight, her dark eyes reflecting the flames like pools of water disturbed by falling leaves. Beside her, 11-year-old Abigail Williams leans forward with the intensity of childhood curiosity barely contained, her breath forming small clouds in the chill air that even the fire cannot fully dispel. Between them sits Tituba, the West Indian woman whose very presence in this Puritan household speaks to the complex contradictions of Reverend Paris's life. Her dark skin gleams like polished wood in the firelight, and her voice carries the music of distant islands where trade winds blow through sugarcane and the rhythm of drums echoes across moonlit beaches. She speaks in the careful English of one who has learned the language of her captors, each word measured and precise, yet underneath runs a current of something older, something that remembers other gods and other ways of seeing the world. "Tell us about the fortune-telling again," Abigail whispers, her young voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire. The request hangs in the air like incense, forbidden and thrilling, a glimpse into mysteries that proper Puritan children should never seek to understand. Tituba glances toward the door, where Reverend Paris might appear at any moment, his stern face set in lines of disapproval that could bring punishment, swift and certain. But the minister is away this evening, called to the bedside of a dying parishioner, and the house feels empty without his commanding presence. From her apron, Tituba withdraws an egg, its white shell smooth and perfect as a prayer. She holds it carefully, as if it contains not just the promise of life, but something far more precious and dangerous. The shell catches the firelight as she moves to the table, where a glass of water waits, clear and still as the surface of a pond on a windless morning. With practiced hands, she cracks the egg, watching as the white spreads through the water like clouds forming in a summer sky. "Look there," she murmurs, pointing to the cloudy formations that swirl and twist in the glass. What do you see, child? What shapes does the white show you? Betty leans forward, her breath fogging the cold air as she peers into the water. The egg white moves with a life of its own, forming patterns that seem to speak of futures both wonderful and terrible. At first, she sees nothing but random swirls, meaningless as foam on a wave. But then, as she watches with the intensity that only children can bring to such mysteries, shapes begin to emerge from the chaos. A house, a tree, a man walking down a road that leads somewhere she cannot see. And then something else, something that makes her stomach clench with a fear she cannot name or understand. In the cloudy white, she sees what looks like a coffin, dark and final, and somehow hungry. She sees a grave, a mound of earth beneath which something waits in eternal silence. She sees death itself, patient and inevitable, reaching out with fingers that feel cold even in the warmth of the kitchen fire. "I see," she begins, then stops, her voice caught in her throat, like a bird in a snare. "I see something dark, something that speaks of endings." That night, as the wind howls through the eaves and snow piles against the windows like grasping fingers, Betty Paris begins to scream. The fits start small, as such things often do. A cry in the darkness, a moment of trembling that her father attributes to winter cold and childish nightmares. The sound echoes through the wooden house like the call of some wild creature, piercing and strange and utterly unlike anything a proper Puritan child should make. Reverend Paris appears at her bedside, his nightgown hastily thrown over his thin shoulders, his face etched with concern that deepens as he watches his daughter writhe beneath her quilted coverlet. She speaks words that no 9-year-old should know, her voice rising and falling in cadences that sound almost like chanting, almost like the forbidden prayers of pagans and heathens. Her small hands claw at the air as if fighting off invisible attackers, and red marks appear on her pale skin as if something unseen is pinching and biting her with malevolent intent. The sight fills her father with a dread that his Harvard education and years of theological study cannot dispel. By February, as the snow continues to fall and the cold seems to penetrate the very foundations of the house, Betty's condition has worsened into something that defies all explanation. She crawls under furniture like a wild animal seeking shelter, her voice rising in barks and howls that echo through the parsonage like the cries of demons. She stretches her arms wide and claims she can fly, her young face twisted into expressions that belong on no child's features. Most disturbing of all, she falls into trances where she speaks in voices that seem to come from somewhere else entirely, using words and phrases that no minister's daughter should ever utter. Abigail Williams soon joins her cousin in these strange afflictions, as if whatever dark force has taken hold of Betty has spread like a contagion through the very air they breathe. The 11-year-old writhes on the wooden floor as if invisible hands are tormenting her, her cries filling the house with sounds that make the very walls seem to tremble. Red welts appear on her arms and face without any visible cause, rising like the marks of some supernatural assault that leaves no earthly evidence of its passing. She complains of being stabbed by needles that no one else can see, of being burned by fires that cast no light and leave no char. When asked who torments her, She can only point to empty air and whisper of shapes that dance just beyond the edge of vision, forms that wear the faces of neighbors and friends, but move with the malevolent purpose of something far more sinister. Word spreads through Salem village like smoke on the winter wind, carried from house to house by voices hushed with fear and fascination. In the Putnam household, where Anne Putnam the elder rules with the sharp tongue and sharper memory for grievances that have made her a formidable presence in village affairs, the news is received with a mixture of concern and something darker. If the devil himself is at work in their midst, then someone must be held accountable. Someone must pay the price for bringing such evil into their godly community. Neighbors gather in circles around their own hearths, their faces grave with the weight of terrible possibility. These are people who have built their lives on the foundation of Puritan faith, who see the hand of divine providence in every falling leaf and every change of weather. To them, the strange afflictions that have seized the Paris children cannot be mere illness or childish fancy. In a world where every event is either divine blessing or diabolic curse, such symptoms demand explanation that reaches beyond the merely physical. Dr. William Griggs arrives at the parsonage on a cold February morning, his leather satchel filled with the tools and remedies of 17th century medicine. He is a learned man, trained in the healing arts at a time when the boundary between medicine and theology remains thin as parchment. His careful examination of the girls reveals nothing that his knowledge can explain or his remedies can cure. He checks their pulses with fingers that have felt the rhythm of life and death in hundreds of patients. He looks into their eyes, searching for the telltale signs of fever or poison. He feels their foreheads and listens to their breathing, applying all the diagnostic skills that years of practice have taught him. But the bottles of physic in his satchel offer no relief for what ails Betty Paris and Abigail Williams. His herbal remedies, his bloodletting, his careful attention to the balance of humours that was thought to govern human health, all prove useless against the forces that seem to have taken possession of the two young girls. As he prepares to leave the parsonage, his face bears the weight of a diagnosis that will change Salem village forever. "I can find no natural cause," he tells Reverend Paris, his words hanging in the cold air like a pronouncement of doom. "The hand of Satan is upon them." The doctor's words strike Salem village like lightning splitting the winter sky. If the devil himself is at work in their midst, then someone in their community has made a pact with darkness. Someone they know, someone they trust, someone who walks among them wearing the mask of innocence while serving the powers of hell. The implications spread through the village consciousness like ripples on a pond, touching every household, every relationship, every assumption about the nature of their carefully ordered world. Reverend Paris kneels beside his daughter's bed that night, watching her small body convulse with forces he cannot understand or combat. His Harvard education, his years of theological study, his deep faith in divine providence, all seem inadequate in the face of this supernatural assault on his household. The books that line his study, the sermons he has preached, the prayers he has offered, none of them provide guidance for confronting such tangible evidence of diabolic intervention in human affairs. "Who torments you?" he whispers, his voice breaking with the weight of paternal anguish and pastoral duty. "Give me a name, child. Tell me who has done this terrible thing." But Betty only whimpers and turns away, her eyes wide with terror at things only she can see. The shapes that dance at the edges of her vision remain invisible to adult eyes, present only in the testimony of a child's voice that speaks with authority no 9-year-old should possess. As word of Dr. Griggs's diagnosis spreads through Salem village, other children begin to display similar symptoms, as if the very knowledge of supernatural assault has opened doorways that should have remained forever sealed. Anne Putnam, Jr., the 12-year-old daughter of one of the village's most influential families, falls into fits that mirror those of the Paris girls. Her mother watches her daughter's suffering with growing fury, her sharp mind already calculating who might be responsible for such an attack on innocent childhood. Mary Warren, a young servant in the household of John Proctor, begins to see visions of dark figures that beckon to her from the shadows between firelight and darkness. Elizabeth Hubbard, niece to Dr. Griggs himself, complains of spectral visitors who pinch and torment her in the deep hours of the night when honest Christians should find peace in sleep. One by one, like dominoes falling in a carefully arranged pattern, young girls throughout Salem village succumb to the same mysterious affliction that has seized Betty Paris and Abigail Williams. The winter of 1692 becomes a season of terror unlike anything Salem village has ever known. Parents bar their doors against threats they cannot see, gathering their children close around fires that seem inadequate against the supernatural cold that has settled over their community. Families speak in whispers of diabolic conspiracies and supernatural assault, their voices hushed with the fear that speaking too loudly might attract the attention of whatever malevolent forces have chosen to make their home among the godly. The careful order that has governed their lives for generations seems to be crumbling beneath the weight of forces beyond human comprehension. The neat boundaries between sacred and profane, between the visible world of daily labor and the invisible realm of spiritual warfare, have become blurred beyond recognition. In a community that has prided itself on godliness and proper behavior, the presence of such obvious supernatural evil challenges every assumption about divine protection and righteous living. Reverend Paris calls for days of fasting and prayer, summoning the entire community to the meeting house where they have gathered for worship since the village's founding. The wooden building, simple and austere in the Puritan manner, fills with the voices of desperate supplication as neighbors who have shared joy and sorrow, harvest and hardship, now unite in pleading for divine intervention against forces that threaten to destroy everything they have built together. But even as they pray, the afflicted girls writhe in their wooden pews, crying out that they can see specters in the very sanctuary itself. Evil spirits mock their worship, they claim, threatening their souls, even in the house of God. The sight of such spiritual warfare being fought in their most sacred space fills the congregation with a dread that transcends ordinary fear and touches something primal in the human soul. There, Abigail Williams suddenly screams, pointing toward the back of the meeting house with a finger that trembles with more than cold. I see her. The witch is there, tormenting us even now. When the congregation turns to look, they see only empty air and wooden benches worn smooth by generations of faithful worship. The spirits that torment the children remain invisible to adult eyes, present only in the testimony of young voices that speak with an authority that seems to come from beyond their years. The disconnect between what the children claim to see and what their elders can perceive creates a sense of helplessness that gnaws at the foundations of community confidence. Pressure mounts on the afflicted girls to name their tormentors, to give faces and names to the invisible forces that plague their days and haunt their nights. Adults gather around them with notebooks and quills, recording every word, every gesture, every description of the supernatural beings that have invaded their peaceful village. The girls, thrust into the center of adult attention in a way that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances, find themselves wielding a power that children should never possess. The weight of expectation hangs heavy in the air as the community waits for the revelation that will allow them to strike back against the forces of darkness. The afflicted children hold the key to understanding what has happened to their world, and their testimony will determine not just the fate of the accused, but the very future of Salem village itself. The names come slowly at first, whispered in voices barely audible above the crackling of winter fires. On February 29th, as the short month draws to its close, and March prepares to bring the first hints of spring to frozen New England, warrants are issued for the arrest of 3 women whose very selection reveals the careful calculation behind the accusations. These are not random choices born of childish fancy, but deliberate targeting of individuals who occupy the margins of Salem village society, women whose differences make them perfect vessels for community fears and suspicions. Tituba stands in the kitchen of the Paris parsonage when the constables arrive, her dark hands busy with the endless tasks of domestic service that have defined her days since her arrival from the Caribbean islands. The woman who taught the children their forbidden games of fortune telling now finds herself at the center of accusations that could cost her life. Her foreign birth, her dark skin, her knowledge of practices that the Puritans consider heathen and dangerous, all combine to make her an obvious target for a community seeking someone to blame for the supernatural terror that has descended upon them. When the iron shackles close around her wrists, Tituba shows no surprise, only the weary resignation of someone who has always known that her position in this rigid society remains precarious beyond measure. She has served the Paris family with loyalty and affection, caring for their children as if they were her own. Yet she understands that such service provides no protection when fear overrides reason and suspicion becomes more powerful than evidence. Sarah Good receives her arrest with the defiant anger that has characterized her interactions with Salem village throughout her years of poverty and social isolation. She stands in the doorway of whatever shelter she has found for the night, her weathered face set in lines of bitter resentment as the constables read the charges against her. Her sharp tongue, her demanding manner, her willingness to speak harsh truths to neighbors who turn her away from their doors, all have earned her enemies throughout the community. Now those enemies have found the perfect weapon to silence her forever. The homeless woman who has wandered from house to house, seeking charity and receiving mostly rejection, spits her contempt at the men who have come to arrest her. "I am innocent of witchcraft," she declares, her voice ringing with the righteous fury of someone who has endured years of persecution for the crime of being poor in a society that sees poverty as evidence of moral failing. But her protests fall on ears already closed to any explanation save supernatural malevolence. Sarah Osborne learns of her arrest while lying in her sickbed, her aging body racked with the ailments that have kept her from regular church attendance and given her enemies ammunition for their accusations. The widow who dared to remarry her indentured servant, who fought legal battles over inheritance that proper women were expected to avoid, who challenged social conventions and paid the price in community disapproval, now faces the ultimate consequence of her independence. Her marriage to Alexander Osborne had been seen as scandalous from the beginning, a violation of the careful social hierarchies that kept servants in their place and widows in their proper sphere of humble submission. Her involvement in contentious legal proceedings over the estate that was meant to pass to her sons had marked her as a woman who refused to accept the role that society had assigned to her. Now, such defiance is reinterpreted as evidence of diabolic alliance, her independence transformed into proof of supernatural corruption. The preliminary hearings begin on March 1st in Ingersoll's Tavern, but the crowd that gathers to witness this confrontation between earthly justice and supernatural evil proves too large for any ordinary venue. The proceedings must be moved to the meeting house, where nearly everyone in Salem village presses together on wooden benches that creak under the weight of community anticipation and fear. The same building where they have gathered for worship and prayer now becomes a theatre where the forces of good and evil will meet in mortal combat. Magistrates John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin take their places at a simple wooden table, their faces grave with the responsibility of determining not just individual guilt or innocence, but the very fate of their community. These are respected men, pillars of colonial society. Yet they bring to their task assumptions and prejudices that will shape every aspect of the proceedings that follow. Their belief in the reality of witchcraft, their acceptance of spectral evidence, their willingness to rely on the testimony of children and young women all reflect the intellectual framework of their time and place. Sarah Good is brought before them first, her chains clanking with each step as she moves through the crowded meeting house. She stands defiant despite her bonds, her weathered face set in lines of anger and resentment that speak to years of harsh treatment at the hands of neighbors who should have shown Christian charity. When Magistrate Hathorne asks if she is guilty of witchcraft, her denial rings through the building with venom that makes some spectators recoil as if from a physical blow. "I am innocent of a witch," she declares, her voice carrying the accumulated bitterness of a lifetime spent on the margins of respectable society. "I know nothing of witchcraft, and if any have accused me falsely, then God will surely punish them for their lies." But as Sarah Good speaks her denial, the afflicted girls erupt into convulsions that transform the solemn proceeding into something approaching a supernatural theatre. They scream that her spectre is attacking them even as her physical body stands chained before the court. They point to invisible wounds, cry out in apparent agony, and beg the magistrates to protect them from the supernatural assault that only they can see. Betty Paris doubles over as if struck by an invisible fist, her young face contorted with pain that seems far too real to be mere performance. Abigail Williams points to marks on her arms that appear even as the spectators watch, red welts that rise without any visible cause. Ann Putnam Jr. falls to the floor in convulsions that shake her entire body, her voice rising in cries that speak of torment beyond ordinary human experience. The spectacle is unlike anything Salem village has ever witnessed, a collision of the visible and invisible worlds that leaves observers stunned and terrified. Here is proof that cannot be denied, evidence that transcends the ordinary standards of legal proceeding and enters the realm of direct revelation. The testimony of the afflicted girls transforms abstract theological concepts about the reality of supernatural evil into dramatic proof that no rational person can dismiss. When Sarah Good attempts to speak in her own defense, her words are drowned out by the cries of the afflicted witnesses. Each time she opens her mouth, the girls fall into fresh paroxysms of supernatural torment, their suffering providing a kind of divine commentary on her denials. The magistrates watch with growing conviction that they are witnessing not merely criminal behavior, but cosmic warfare between the forces of Christ and Satan. "What evil spirit are you familiar with?" Magistrate Hathorne demands, his voice cutting through the chaos of supernatural assault and courtroom drama. "What covenant have you made with the devil that gives you power to torment these innocent children?" Sarah Good's denials grow weaker as the evidence of spectral attack mounts before the eyes of the entire community. Her protestations of innocence seem pathetic in the face of such overwhelming proof of supernatural malevolence. The woman who has spent years fighting for survival on the margins of society now finds herself abandoned even by those who might once have shown her sympathy. Sarah Osborne is brought forward next, her frail form supported by constables as she struggles to stand before her accusers. The widow, whose irregular church attendance and contentious legal battles have already marked her as suspect, now faces accusations that transform past controversies into evidence of diabolic alliance. Her failure to attend worship regularly becomes proof of spiritual corruption. Her involvement in inheritance disputes becomes evidence of supernatural greed that reaches beyond the grave. Again, the afflicted girls erupt into fits of supernatural torment as Osborne attempts to proclaim her innocence. They claim to see her spectre flying through the air, pinching and biting them with invisible hands, while her physical body stands helpless before the court. Their dramatic performances convince even skeptical observers that dark forces are indeed at work in Salem village, that the devil himself has chosen their community as a battleground in his eternal war against righteousness. The pattern established in these first examinations will govern all subsequent proceedings. The physical presence of the accused serves as a catalyst for spectral attack that only the afflicted witnesses can perceive. Their suffering provides proof of guilt that transcends ordinary legal standards and enters the realm of divine revelation. The courtroom becomes a stage where earthly justice and supernatural drama intersect in ways that both thrill and terrify the assembled spectators. But it is Tituba's examination that transforms the entire nature of the crisis, changing what might have remained a localized investigation into 3 marginal women into a community-wide emergency that threatens the very foundations of Puritan society. The West Indian woman stands before the magistrates with downcast eyes, her dark skin almost grey in the dim light of the meeting house, crowded with neighbours who have watched her serve the Paris family with apparent loyalty and devotion. When asked if she is guilty of witchcraft, Tituba does not offer the denials that have characterized the testimony of Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. Instead, she begins to speak in a voice barely above a whisper, describing a world of supernatural terror that sends chills through every listener and transforms the legal proceeding into something approaching a confession of cosmic significance. "The devil came to me," she says, her accented English soft but clear in the hushed atmosphere of the meeting house. "He bid me serve him, and when I refused, he threatened me with death, and worse than death." A collective gasp rises from the assembled crowd as they hear the first direct admission of supernatural contact from one of the accused witches. Here is confession, acknowledgement of diabolic alliance from someone who has lived among them, who has prepared their food and cared for their children and shared their daily lives. The revelation that such evil has walked in their midst, wearing the mask of domestic service, fills them with horror that transcends ordinary fear. But Tituba is only beginning her tale of supernatural seduction and diabolic conspiracy. She describes meetings with Satan himself, who appeared to her sometimes as a man dressed in black clothes, sometimes as a great dog with eyes like burning coals, sometimes as a red cat that spoke with human voice and commanded her to sign his book with her own blood. The details she provides are so vivid, so specific, so unlike anything that could spring from mere imagination, that even skeptical listeners find themselves convinced of their truth. She tells of being forced to travel through the air to distant gatherings, where witches from throughout New England met to plot the destruction of godly Christians and the corruption of innocent children. She describes rituals that mock Christian worship, ceremonies that invert every sacred symbol and transform divine blessing into diabolic curse. Her testimony provides a window into a hidden world of supernatural evil that exists parallel to ordinary life, invisible to the righteous but terrifyingly real to those who have been drawn into its web. Most shocking of all, Tituba reveals that she is not alone in her supernatural servitude. There are other witches in Salem village, she claims, a conspiracy of evil that reaches into every corner of their community and includes individuals whose public faces of piety and respectability mask hearts corrupted by diabolic alliance. She has seen them at the devil's meetings, she says, where they pledge themselves to his service and receive power to torment the innocent and corrupt the faithful. How many witches are there? The magistrates press, their voices tight with the terrible urgency of men who realize they are confronting not isolated criminal behavior, but organized supernatural warfare against everything they hold sacred. 9, Tituba replies, her voice dropping to a whisper that forces the entire assembly to strain forward to hear. There are 9 witches in Salem, and I have seen them all gathered together in service to the devil himself. The confession electrifies Salem village like lightning striking a powder magazine. If Tituba is telling the truth, then the three women already accused represent merely the visible portion of a diabolic conspiracy that threatens the very foundations of Christian civilization in New England. 6 more witches walk among them, wearing masks of innocence while serving the powers of darkness, their true allegiance known only to Satan and to those who share their terrible secret. The implications spread through the community consciousness like fire through dry timber. If 9 witches live among them, then anyone might be secretly allied with evil. The neighbor who seems most godly, the church member who appears most devout, the family friend who has shared their table and their prayers, any of them might be agents of supernatural malevolence, working to destroy everything the colonists have struggled to build in the wilderness of New England. Tituba's confession provides the theological framework that will govern all subsequent investigations and prosecutions. Her detailed descriptions of diabolic meetings and supernatural activities create a narrative structure for understanding the strange events that have disrupted the ordered life of Salem village. Her revelation of an organized conspiracy of evil transforms individual accusations into a coordinated response to a threat that reaches far beyond any single household or family. The woman who had entertained the Paris children with stories from her Caribbean homeland now provides testimony that will reshape their understanding of the very nature of reality. Her words bridge the gap between the visible world of daily experience and the invisible realm of spiritual warfare, offering proof that the boundary between natural and supernatural is far more permeable than anyone had dared to imagine. As spring arrives and the snow begins to melt, revealing the brown earth that has lain hidden beneath winter's white blanket, the implications of Tituba's confession begin to unfold throughout Salem village. If she has told the truth about the extent of diabolic conspiracy in their midst, then the 3 women already accused represent only the beginning of a much larger investigation that will test every relationship, challenge every assumption, and transform their understanding of the community they thought they knew. The careful social order that has governed their lives for generations suddenly seems fragile as morning frost, subject to disruption by forces they can neither see nor fully comprehend. The revelation that supernatural evil has taken root in their very midst challenges every assumption about divine protection and righteous living, forcing them to confront the possibility that their godly community has become a battleground in the eternal war between Christ and Satan. The accusations that follow Tituba's shocking confession spread through Salem village like ripples on a pond, each new name sending fresh waves of terror through a community already reeling from the revelation that diabolic conspiracy has taken root in their midst. The spring of 1692 brings not the usual renewal of hope and life, but a dark flowering of suspicion and fear that transforms neighbors into potential enemies and friends into objects of dread. Martha Corey discovers her peril on a morning when the March wind still carries winter's bite, but the first green shoots of grass push through the thawing earth, with the stubborn persistence of life asserting itself against the dying cold. She sits by her kitchen fire, her weathered hands busy with the mending that occupies the daylight hours of every goodwife in Salem village, when word reaches her that the afflicted girls have begun to speak her name in their tormented ravings. The irony cuts deep as a blade pressed against bone. Martha Corey, church member and woman of apparent piety, had been among the first to express skepticism about the reality of the supernatural assault that supposedly plagued the young witnesses. Her questioning voice, raised in careful doubt during conversations with neighbors, had suggested that perhaps the girls' afflictions might have natural rather than supernatural causes. Such skepticism, which might have been welcomed as the voice of reason in a more measured time, now becomes evidence of guilt in a community where doubt itself is seen as diabolic deception. When the afflicted girls fall into their familiar convulsions at the mention of her name, their cries take on a particular venom that speaks to the threat they perceive in Martha Corey's rational questions. Here is a woman who has dared to challenge their testimony, who has suggested that their suffering might be something less than genuine supernatural assault. In their spectral visions, they see her attending the devil's meetings, signing his book with her own blood, and using the dark powers he has granted her to mock their pain and question their truth. The sight of Martha Corey being led away in chains sends shockwaves through the church community that have felt secure in their faith and confident in their salvation. If a woman who sits in the same pew every Sunday, who participates in the same prayers and hymns, who shares the same communion bread and wine, can be secretly allied with Satan, then the very foundations of their spiritual life are called into question. The boundaries between saint and sinner, elect and reprobate, saved and damned, become blurred beyond recognition. But it is the accusation against Rebecca Nurse that truly divides Salem village and forces every resident to choose sides in a conflict that transcends ordinary legal proceedings. The elderly woman whose reputation for Christian charity and gentle nature has made her beloved throughout the community becomes the most shocking target of the expanding web of supernatural suspicion that now entangles rich and poor, young and old, the socially prominent and the marginally respectable. Rebecca Nurse has lived her entire life as an exemplar of Puritan virtue, her days measured out in acts of kindness and service that have touched nearly every family in Salem village. She has nursed the sick through long nights of fever and delirium, comforted the bereaved in their darkest hours of grief, and shared her own meager resources with those even less fortunate than herself. Her voice has been raised in prayer at countless bedsides. Her hands have prepared food for families struck by illness or misfortune. Her presence has brought comfort to those facing the valley of the shadow of death. When the warrant for her arrest is read aloud in the meeting house on a grey March morning, the silence that follows seems to stretch like an eternity. Neighbors who have known Rebecca Nurse for decades struggle to reconcile the accusations against her with their own experiences of her kindness and generosity. The woman who has embodied everything they understand about Christian charity now stands accused of the very antithesis of such virtue. The division that splits Salem village over Rebecca Nurse's case cuts deeper than any previous controversy, creating factions that line up not just according to belief in her guilt or innocence, but according to long-standing loyalties and grievances that have been festering beneath the surface of community life for years. The Nurse family has been involved in ongoing disputes with the Putnam clan over land boundaries, church governance, and ministerial authority. Conflicts that now take on cosmic significance as earthly disagreements are reinterpreted as evidence of supernatural warfare. Those who support Rebecca Nurse gather signatures for petitions that attest to her Christian character and exemplary behavior throughout her long life. They speak of her acts of mercy, her faithful church attendance, her devotion to prayer and scripture study. They point to her reputation for honesty and integrity, her willingness to help neighbors in need, her gentle manner with children and the elderly. Their testimonies paint a picture of a woman whose entire existence has been devoted to serving God and caring for others. But their voices are drowned out by the dramatic testimony of the afflicted witnesses whose convulsions and cries provide a form of supernatural theater that no amount of character testimony can overcome. When Rebecca Nurse is brought into the courtroom, the girls fall into fits that seem even more violent than usual, their bodies contorting with apparent agony as they claim her spectre is tormenting them with unusual cruelty. They describe visions of her flying through the air to diabolic meetings, her aged form transformed by supernatural power into an instrument of evil that mocks her reputation for saintliness. The geographical pattern of accusations begins to reveal the underlying tensions that have shaped Salem village life for decades. Most of the accused witches come from the western portion of the village, while most of the afflicted witnesses live in the eastern section that has been involved in disputes with the accused or their families. The invisible lines of spectral attack seem to follow the visible boundaries of property disputes, family feuds, and political disagreements that have been poisoning community relationships since the village's founding. The Putnam family emerges as the driving force behind many of the accusations, their influence extending through kinship networks and political alliances that reach into every corner of village life. Anne Putnam Sr., whose sharp tongue and keen memory for grievances have made her a formidable presence in local affairs, watches the proceedings with satisfaction that barely conceals her sense of vindication. The supernatural crisis has provided the perfect weapon for settling old scores and resolving conflicts that have proven intractable through ordinary legal means. As spring progresses and the number of accused individuals continues to multiply, the jails in Salem and Boston begin to overflow with defendants awaiting trial or execution. The sheriff's men ride out daily to serve new warrants, their approach striking terror into households throughout eastern Massachusetts as the web of accusation spreads beyond Salem village to encompass surrounding communities. Men and women, young and old, rich and poor, all find themselves chained in dark cells on the testimony of witnesses who claim to see invisible spirits that no adult can perceive. Entire families find themselves under suspicion as the diabolic conspiracy described by the afflicted witnesses expands to include wives and husbands, parents and children, masters and servants who are supposedly bound together by their shared allegiance to Satan. The idea that witchcraft might run in bloodlines or spread through household connections leads to arrests that sweep up multiple members of the same family, leaving children orphaned and farms abandoned as productive members of society disappear into the colonial justice system. The seasonal rhythm that has governed agricultural life for generations is disrupted as farmers find themselves either imprisoned as suspected witches or afraid to work their fields, lest they attract the attention of supernatural forces. The careful balance between survival and spiritual devotion that has characterized frontier existence becomes impossible to maintain when any unexplained misfortune might be interpreted as evidence of diabolic assault. Crops go unplanted, livestock wander untended, and normal commercial activities grind to a halt as the community focuses its attention on the daily drama of accusations and examinations. The meeting house becomes the center of village life in ways that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. The same building where Salem village has gathered for worship and prayer now serves as a theater where earthly justice and supernatural drama intersect in proceedings that draw crowds from throughout New England. The wooden benches that have supported generations of faithful worshippers now accommodate spectators who come to witness the confrontation between good and evil that seems to be playing out in their very midst. The accused witches themselves represent a cross-section of colonial society that reveals the arbitrary nature of supernatural suspicion when it achieves the status of legal proceeding. Bridget Bishop, with her colorful clothing and independent manner, represents the type of woman who has always attracted gossip and disapproval in Puritan society. Her operation of a tavern, her entertainment of guests with games and music, her willingness to dress in bright colors rather than the somber clothing favored by the godly, all mark her as someone whose spiritual condition has long been questionable in the eyes of her neighbors. John Proctor emerges as one of the most prominent male targets of the expanding accusations, his case illustrating the dangerous position occupied by anyone who dares to question the reality of the supernatural conspiracy or the reliability of spectral evidence. The tavern keeper, whose frank manner and occasional criticism of village politics have made him enemies among those who see any questioning of authority as potential rebellion against divine order, now finds himself accused of the very crime he has dared to doubt. Proctor's skepticism about the proceedings has been vocal and public, his common-sense approach to the girl's afflictions marking him as a dangerous voice of reason in a community increasingly devoted to supernatural explanations for every unexplained phenomenon. His suggestion that the afflicted witnesses might be engaging in deliberate deception rather than suffering genuine supernatural assault makes him a target for accusations that serve both to silence his criticism and to demonstrate the reach of diabolic conspiracy into every level of society. The involvement of men like Proctor in the expanding web of accusations serves to validate the testimony of the afflicted witnesses and demonstrate that the supernatural threat extends far beyond the marginal women who were first accused. If respectable male property owners can be secretly allied with Satan, then the diabolic conspiracy reaches into the very heart of colonial society and threatens the foundations of patriarchal authority that govern both family and community life. The role of confession in the legal proceedings becomes increasingly problematic as observers begin to realize that admission of guilt provides the only reliable path to survival, while maintaining innocence almost invariably leads to conviction and execution. The promise of life in exchange for confession creates powerful incentives for false testimony that contaminate the entire judicial process with the poison of coerced admission. Those who confess are spared the gallows, but condemned to live with the knowledge that they have purchased their lives at the cost of their integrity. Those who maintain their innocence find themselves caught in a trap that makes conviction almost inevitable. Their denials are interpreted as evidence of diabolic deception, their protests dismissed as the lies of servants of Satan who cannot be trusted to speak truth even when facing death. The very firmness of their denials becomes proof of their guilt, while any wavering or uncertainty is taken as evidence that they are beginning to acknowledge their crimes under the pressure of divine justice. The expansion of accusations to include individuals from the highest levels of colonial society begins to create political problems that extend far beyond the boundaries of Salem village. When the afflicted witnesses begin to name prominent figures whose social and political connections reach throughout New England, the supernatural conspiracy they describe starts to appear either so extensive as to threaten the entire colonial establishment, or so indiscriminate as to lack credibility. The accusation against Lady Phips, wife of Governor William Phips himself, represents a turning point that forces colonial authorities to confront the implications of a judicial process that seems to have escaped all reasonable bounds. If the governor's own wife can be accused of witchcraft based on spectral evidence that no one else can verify, then the proceedings have reached a level of absurdity that threatens the very foundations of political authority in Massachusetts Bay Colony. Similar accusations against other prominent figures create a crisis of confidence in the entire judicial system that has been established to combat the supernatural threat. Ministers, merchants, and political leaders who had initially supported the trials as necessary measures to protect the community from diabolic assault begin to question whether the cure for witchcraft has become worse than the disease itself. The international context also begins to play a role in generating doubts about the Salem proceedings, as reports circulate of similar witch trials in Europe that have been discontinued or reversed when comparable questions about evidence and procedure have been raised. The possibility that Massachusetts Bay Colony is pursuing policies that have been abandoned elsewhere as ineffective or unjust creates additional pressure for reconsideration of the entire approach to combating supernatural crime. The summer of 1692 becomes a season of unprecedented judicial activity as the newly established Court of Oyer and Terminer works to process the ever-growing number of witchcraft cases that fill the colonial jails. The careful legal procedures that govern ordinary criminal prosecutions seem inadequate to the extraordinary challenge of combating supernatural evil, leading to innovations and adaptations that will have far-reaching consequences for both the accused individuals and the broader community that watches in fascination and growing horror. The summer sun beats down mercilessly on Gallows Hill as the first condemned witch is led to her death on June 10th, her chains clanking with each step as she climbs the rocky path that will end at the hangman's noose. Bridget Bishop walks with the same defiant stride that has characterized her entire life, her colorful clothing replaced by the rough prison garb that marks her final descent from independent woman to condemned criminal. Behind her follows a crowd of hundreds who have gathered from throughout New England to witness this historic moment when earthly justice will finally strike back against the forces of supernatural evil that have plagued their community. The gallows tree stands stark against the summer sky, its wooden beam weathered by countless New England storms, but strong enough to bear the weight of divine justice. The rope that dangles from its crosspiece has been carefully prepared by hands that understand the sacred nature of their task, knotted with the precision that befits an instrument of God's wrath against those who have chosen to serve his eternal enemy. The crowd gathers in a rough circle around the execution site, their faces bearing expressions that mix satisfaction with horror, relief with revulsion, as they prepare to witness the first decisive blow against the diabolic conspiracy that has terrorized their world. Bridget Bishop maintains her innocence to the very end, her voice carrying across the assembled multitude as she proclaims her faith in Christ and her hope for salvation despite the charges that have brought her to this terrible place. Her final words are drowned out by the murmur of spectators who have convinced themselves that they are witnessing not the death of an innocent woman, but the destruction of an agent of Satan, whose execution will help to purify their community and restore the divine protection they believe they have lost. As the rope tightens around her neck and her body jerks with the final spasms of life departing, many in the crowd feel a sense of relief that justice has been done and the supernatural threat is finally being addressed with the decisive action it demands. The sight of Bridget Bishop's lifeless form swaying in the summer breeze seems to validate everything they have believed about the reality of witchcraft and the necessity of extreme measures to combat it. Here is proof that their fears were justified, their accusations well-founded, their legal proceedings divinely sanctioned. But instead of bringing the crisis to an end, Bishop's execution serves only to increase the momentum of the trials and validate the spectral evidence upon which all subsequent prosecutions will be based. If the court was willing to take a human life based on the testimony of the afflicted witnesses, then that testimony must be reliable and the supernatural threat real enough to justify the ultimate sanction. The execution creates a precedent that makes future deaths not only possible, but inevitable, each hanging serving to justify the next in an ascending spiral of judicial violence. The summer heat that follows seems to press down on Salem village like a living thing, the air thick with humidity and the weight of unspoken fears that have taken on a life of their own. In the sweltering courtroom where the trials continue daily, the temperature rises, not just from the crush of sweating bodies, but from the intensity of supernatural drama that plays out before packed audiences hungry for the next revelation of diabolic conspiracy. The afflicted witnesses continue their performances with increasing skill and confidence, their convulsions and cries providing theatre that rivals any entertainment available in the colonies. July 19th brings 5 more condemned souls to Gallows Hill in a mass execution that demonstrates the court's determination to root out every trace of supernatural evil from their community. Sarah Good walks to her death with the same bitter defiance that has characterized her entire struggle against a society that has rejected and despised her from birth to grave. Her final curse upon Reverend Nicholas Noyce, who has pronounced her guilty and unrepentant, rings across the assembled crowd like a prophecy of doom that will haunt the minister for the rest of his days. Rebecca Nurse faces her execution with the quiet dignity that has marked her entire life, her aged face serene despite the terror of the occasion and the knowledge that she dies for crimes she has never committed. The sight of this saintly woman being led to the gallows moves even hardened observers to tears and doubt, creating the first serious cracks in the wall of community support for the proceedings. Her supporters weep openly as they watch someone they consider a model of Christian virtue pay the ultimate price for supernatural crimes that seem impossible to reconcile with their knowledge of her character. Susanna Martin approaches her death with laughter that chills the blood of those who hear it, claiming that the devil is a liar who will never succeed in claiming her soul despite the false accusations that have brought her to this place. Her defiance in the face of death creates an uncomfortable tension in the crowd, forcing observers to confront the possibility that innocent people might indeed be dying for crimes they have not committed. The sound of her voice, strong and clear despite her advanced age, carries across Gallows Hill like a challenge to everything the spectators believe about the justice of their cause. Elizabeth Howe dies with prayers upon her lips and tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, her final words a plea for divine forgiveness, not for the crimes of which she has been accused, but for the sins of those who have condemned her without cause. Her obvious faith and sincere devotion create doubt even among those who have been most convinced of her guilt, forcing them to question whether the spectral evidence upon which her conviction rests might be less reliable than they have been led to believe. Sarah Wildes meets her end in silence, her face set in lines of resignation that speak to a lifetime of hardship and disappointment culminating in this final injustice. Her quiet acceptance of her fate provides a stark contrast to the dramatic protestations of innocence offered by some of the other condemned, creating an atmosphere of solemnity that settles over the crowd like a shroud. The sight of her lifeless body joining the others beneath the gallows tree forces observers to confront the reality that they are witnessing not a celebration of divine justice, but a tragedy of human error and misplaced fear. As the summer progresses and the death toll mounts, the character of the accusations begins to change in ways that reveal the arbitrary nature of supernatural suspicion when it achieves institutional sanction. The net of accusation spreads beyond the marginal figures who were initially targeted to encompass individuals whose social standing and moral reputation should have provided protection against such charges. Ministers find themselves accused alongside tavern keepers, wealthy merchants alongside homeless beggars, church members of unquestioned piety alongside those whose spiritual condition has always been suspect. The August executions bring even more shocking revelations, as George Burroughs, a former minister of Salem village, finds himself condemned not merely as a witch, but as the very king of witches in New England, Satan's chief representative in the ongoing war against Christian civilization. The sight of an ordained minister being led to the gallows creates a crisis of faith that extends far beyond Salem village to challenge the foundations of Puritan society throughout the colonies. Burroughs's case illustrates the dangerous precedent set by accepting spectral evidence as the primary foundation for criminal conviction. The former minister's physical strength, demonstrated by his ability to lift heavy barrels and carry massive weights, is reinterpreted as evidence of supernatural power granted by diabolic alliance. His knowledge of theology and ability to quote scripture becomes proof of his cunning as Satan's servant, rather than evidence of his calling as a minister of Christ. Even on the gallows, Burroughs maintains his innocence and demonstrates his faith by reciting the Lord's Prayer perfectly, something that witches were supposedly unable to do according to contemporary belief. The sight of a condemned witch speaking Christ's own words without error creates consternation among the spectators, who must either acknowledge that an innocent man is about to die or find some way to explain away this apparent proof of his righteousness. Cotton Mather, the influential Boston minister who has supported the trials from their beginning, provides the explanation that allows the execution to proceed despite this troubling evidence. He proclaims to the crowd that the devil has given Burroughs special power to deceive the faithful by appearing righteous even in his final moments. This theological interpretation allows the spectators to witness the execution of a man who appears to be innocent while maintaining their belief in the justice of the proceedings. John Proctor dies on the same August day, his final words protesting not only his own innocence, but the fundamental injustice of proceedings that have condemned honest citizens based on evidence that no reasonable court should accept. His death removes one of the most vocal critics of the trials and sends a clear message to anyone else who might be tempted to question the reality of spectral evidence or the reliability of the afflicted witnesses. The tavern keeper, who had dared to suggest that the girls might be engaging in deliberate deception rather than suffering genuine supernatural assault, becomes a martyr to the cause of rational skepticism in an age when reason has been overwhelmed by fear. His execution serves as a warning to others who might dare to voice doubts about the proceedings, demonstrating that criticism of the trials themselves can be interpreted as evidence of diabolic alliance. John Willard, a constable who had refused to arrest more accused witches after becoming convinced of their innocence, finds himself condemned by the very system he had once served. His transformation from law enforcement officer to condemned criminal illustrates the complete breakdown of normal legal procedure when spectral evidence is accepted as sufficient proof of guilt. The man who had sworn to uphold justice becomes its victim when justice itself is redefined to accommodate supernatural crimes that exist only in the testimony of witnesses whose reliability cannot be questioned. George Jacobs Sr. faces his execution with the dignity of age and the wisdom of someone who has lived long enough to see through the hysteria that has gripped his community. The elderly man's calm acceptance of his fate provides a stark contrast to the frenzied atmosphere of accusation and conviction that has characterized the trials. His death removes another voice of experience and moderation from a community that desperately needs such guidance. Martha Carrier goes to her death with defiance that matches her reputation as one of the most formidable women in the region. Her refusal to confess or show repentance for crimes she has not committed creates admiration even among those who believe in her guilt. The woman whom Cotton Mather has called a rampant hag maintains her strength and independence even in the face of death, becoming a symbol of resistance to the forces that seek to destroy anyone who refuses to conform to their vision of proper behavior. The September executions mark the culmination of the court's deadly work, as 8 more condemned witches are led to Gallows Hill on the 22nd day of the month. Among them walks Martha Corey, whose initial skepticism about the proceedings has led to her own condemnation, in a perfect example of how doubt itself has become evidence of guilt. The church member who had dared to question the reliability of spectral evidence now pays the ultimate price for her rational approach to supernatural claims. Mary Easty, sister of the already executed Rebecca Nurse, approaches her death with a dignity that moves even hardened observers to tears and serious reflection about the justice of the proceedings. Her final petition to the court, written in her own hand from her prison cell, asks not for her own life, but for an end to the trials that are destroying innocent people throughout New England. Her words provide a voice of reason and compassion in the midst of judicial madness that has consumed all semblance of mercy or restraint. Alice Parker and Anne Pudiata represent the continuing expansion of accusations to encompass women whose only crimes appear to be their independence and refusal to conform to social expectations about proper feminine behavior. Their deaths demonstrate that the trials have become a mechanism for eliminating anyone who challenges conventional norms or threatens established authority structures. Wilmot Redd and Margaret Scott complete the roster of September victims, their executions serving to demonstrate that even the humblest members of society are not safe from accusations that can elevate the most trivial neighborhood disputes into matters of supernatural significance. Their deaths bring the total number of executions to 19, with one additional victim having died under the terrible weight of pressing stones rather than submit to a legal process he refused to acknowledge. But it is the death of Giles Corey that haunts Salem through the autumn months and into the cold winter that follows. The elderly farmer's refusal to enter a plea when accused of witchcraft creates a legal crisis that the authorities resolve through recourse to one of the most brutal punishments known to English law. On September 19th, Giles Corey is subjected to peine forte et dure, the pressing as heavy stones are piled upon his chest in an attempt to force him to enter a plea that will allow his trial to proceed. For 2 days, the 80-year-old man endures the crushing weight while officials demand that he speak the words that will either condemn him to trial and likely execution or allow him to maintain his defiant silence unto death. His only response to their entreaties is a request for more weight, spoken through lips crushed by the stones that are slowly ending his life. The sight of such courage in the face of such torture creates a powerful symbol of resistance to judicial tyranny that will inspire future generations to question authority and defend principle even at the cost of life itself. When Giles Corey finally dies on the 2nd day of his ordeal, his death sends shockwaves through Salem village and the broader colonial community that extend far beyond the immediate horror of witnessing such barbaric punishment. Here is a man who has chosen death rather than participate in legal proceedings he considers fundamentally unjust, whose silence speaks more eloquently than any words could about the nature of the crisis that has gripped their community. The pressing of Giles Corey represents the logical conclusion of a judicial process that has abandoned all pretense of seeking truth in favor of extracting confessions and eliminating opposition. The old man's defiant death forces observers to confront the possibility that the cure for witchcraft has indeed become worse than the disease, that the proceedings established to protect innocent life have become a mechanism for destroying it. As autumn deepens and the leaves turn gold and crimson in the forests surrounding Salem village, the momentum of the trials begins to slow under the weight of mounting criticism and growing doubt about the reliability of spectral evidence. The sheer number of accusations, the prominent status of some of the accused, and the arbitrary nature of the charges all combine to create an atmosphere of uncertainty that had not existed during the summer months of peak hysteria and unquestioning faith in the supernatural conspiracy that supposedly threatened their world. The autumn wind that whistles through the bare branches of Salem's ancient oaks carries with it more than just the promise of winter's approach. As October settles over Massachusetts Bay colony like a heavy blanket, the very air seems thick with doubt and uncertainty that had been unthinkable just months earlier when the trials began with such righteous fervor and unshakable conviction. The leaves that fall in golden showers from the maple trees seem to whisper questions that grow louder with each passing day. Each new accusation, each execution that fails to bring the promised peace to a community torn apart by supernatural terror and judicial excess. In the study of Reverend Increase Mather, perhaps the most respected theological voice in all of New England, candlelight flickers across pages covered with careful handwriting as the learned minister struggles to reconcile his faith in divine providence with the troubling reality of what has transpired in Salem village. His pen scratches across the parchment as he crafts arguments that will challenge the very foundation upon which the trials have been built. Theological reasoning that cuts to the heart of whether spectral evidence can ever provide sufficient proof for taking human life. The treatise that emerges from Mather's careful study carries the weight of decades of theological scholarship and pastoral experience. His central argument strikes like lightning at the core assumption that has governed the Salem proceedings. If Satan possesses the power to assume the form of innocent persons in order to deceive observers, he reasons with inexorable logic, then the spectral evidence that forms the primary foundation for most convictions becomes not just unreliable, but actively dangerous to the cause of justice itself. The implications of Mather's reasoning spread through the intellectual community of New England like ripples on a pond, reaching ministers and magistrates who had previously supported the trials with unquestioning enthusiasm. If the devil can indeed appear wearing the face of righteous persons to mislead the afflicted witnesses, then every execution carried out on the basis of spectral testimony might represent not the triumph of divine justice, but the success of diabolic deception in destroying innocent lives through the very institutions established to protect them. Governor William Phips finds himself caught between competing pressures that threaten to tear apart the delicate political balance he has worked so carefully to maintain since his return from England with the new royal charter that restored some measure of stability to the colony. The jails overflow with accused witches whose cases demand resolution, yet the cost of maintaining such an extensive legal proceeding has begun to strain the colonial treasury beyond its capacity to bear. More troubling still, the accusations have begun to reach into the highest levels of society, threatening individuals whose political connections extend throughout New England and beyond. The accusation against his own wife, Lady Phipps, represents a turning point that forces the governor to confront the reality that the proceedings he established to protect his colony from supernatural threat have escaped all reasonable bounds. When the afflicted witnesses begin to claim that the governor's own household harbors servants of Satan, the diabolic conspiracy they describe becomes either so extensive as to threaten the entire colonial establishment, or so indiscriminate as to lack any credibility whatsoever. Similar accusations against other prominent figures create a crisis of confidence that extends far beyond the boundaries of Salem village to challenge the foundations of political authority throughout Massachusetts Bay Colony. When Samuel Willard, minister of Boston's prestigious Old South Church, finds his name whispered by the afflicted witnesses as they describe their spectral tormentors, even the court clerk seems reluctant to record such a shocking charge against one of the colony's most respected religious leaders. The case of Captain John Alden, son of the legendary Plymouth Pilgrim, whose name carries the weight of New England's founding mythology, illustrates the complete breakdown of social and political restraint that has characterized the trials from their beginning. When this war hero and respected citizen finds himself accused of attending diabolic meetings and consorting with the devil himself, the absurdity of the charges becomes apparent even to those who have been most supportive of the proceedings. Alden's response to his accusation provides a model of dignified resistance that contrasts sharply with the helpless terror of earlier defendants who lacked his social standing and political connections. Rather than submit to imprisonment and await trial on charges that he considers beneath contempt, the captain chooses to flee Massachusetts entirely, escaping to New York, where he can await the restoration of reason to his home colony while maintaining his freedom and his honor. The flight of such a prominent citizen sends shockwaves through the political establishment that extend far beyond Salem village to reach the corridors of power in Boston and London. If men of Alden's stature find it necessary to abandon their homes rather than face the colonial justice system, then something has gone fundamentally wrong with the legal proceedings that were supposed to protect the innocent while punishing the guilty. The practical problems of maintaining such an extensive prosecution begin to overwhelm the administrative capacity of the colonial government as autumn progresses toward winter. The costs of housing and feeding hundreds of accused witches in jails that were never designed for such massive occupancy strain the colonial treasury beyond its ability to cope. Families throughout New England find themselves financially ruined by the fees required to maintain their imprisoned relatives, creating economic hardship that extends far beyond the immediate circle of those directly accused. The disruption to normal economic activity threatens the very survival of the communities that depend upon careful coordination of agricultural and commercial activities to sustain themselves through the harsh New England winter that approaches with inexorable certainty. Farms lie fallow because their owners rot in jail cells. Businesses close because their proprietors have fled to escape accusation, and trade networks collapse as fear and suspicion replace the trust and cooperation that make commerce possible. The international context also begins to play an increasingly important role in shaping colonial attitudes toward the trials, as reports arrive from Europe describing similar witch prosecutions that have been discontinued or reversed when comparable questions about evidence and procedure have been raised. The possibility that Massachusetts Bay Colony is pursuing policies that have been abandoned elsewhere as ineffective or unjust creates additional pressure for reconsideration of the entire approach to combating supernatural crime. Letters from London carry subtle but unmistakable signals of disapproval from royal officials who view the Salem proceedings as evidence of colonial instability and poor judgment. The new charter that Governor Phips has brought from England comes with obligations to demonstrate that Massachusetts can govern itself with the wisdom and restraint expected of a mature political entity, not the hysteria and excess that have characterized the witch trials. The seasonal rhythm that has governed New England life since the first colonists arrived begins to assert itself with irresistible force as the approach of winter demands attention to practical matters of survival that cannot be postponed for supernatural investigations. Firewood must be cut and stacked, food must be preserved and stored, buildings must be repaired and winterized, all tasks that require the kind of sustained community cooperation that has become impossible in an atmosphere of universal suspicion and fear. The afflicted witnesses themselves begin to show signs of the enormous psychological pressure they have endured for months as the primary instruments through which the community has sought to identify and eliminate supernatural threats. Some appear to be pulling back from their earlier claims, expressing uncertainty about details they had previously described with confident precision. Others seem exhausted by the constant attention and responsibility that their testimony has brought. The weight of holding power over life and death proving too heavy for young shoulders to bear indefinitely. The recognition that children and young women have been carrying burdens far beyond their years creates sympathy even among those who have been most convinced of the reality of supernatural conspiracy. The sight of girls who should be playing with dolls and learning domestic skills, instead wielding the power to send neighbors to the gallows, begins to strike observers as fundamentally wrong, a violation of natural order that suggests something has gone badly awry with their understanding of divine will and human justice. On October 29th, as the autumn wind strips the last leaves from the oak trees that have watched over Salem village through all its trials and tribulations, Governor Phips issues a proclamation that effectively ends the Court of Oyer and Terminer's jurisdiction over witchcraft cases. The brief document, couched in the careful language of official pronouncement, marks the beginning of the end for proceedings that have claimed 20 lives and torn apart the fabric of communities throughout eastern Massachusetts. The dissolution of the special court comes not as a dramatic reversal based on new evidence or sudden enlightenment, but as the quiet acknowledgement of a political and judicial reality that can no longer be sustained. The practical problems of maintaining such extensive prosecutions, the political dangers of accusations that reach into the highest levels of society, and the growing intellectual criticism of spectral evidence all combine to make continuation of the trials more costly than beneficial to the colonial government. A new superior court of judicature is established to handle the remaining cases, but this tribunal operates under different rules that exclude spectral evidence as the primary foundation for conviction. The change in evidentiary standards means that most of the remaining cases collapse immediately for lack of credible proof, demonstrating how thoroughly the previous proceedings had depended upon testimony that could neither be verified nor challenged through ordinary legal means. Of the 52 cases that come before the new court, only 3 result in convictions, and these are immediately reprieved by gubernatorial order that makes clear the colonial government's determination to end the crisis rather than continue prosecutions under more restrictive legal standards. The message could not be clearer. The witch trials are over, not because all the witches have been found and eliminated, but because the community has lost faith in its ability to distinguish between supernatural guilt and natural innocence. The process of releasing the imprisoned defendants proves almost as complex as their original prosecution had been, as many families find themselves unable to pay the fees required for their relatives' freedom. The cruel irony that innocent people remain in jail simply because they cannot afford the cost of their own imprisonment adds another layer of injustice to proceedings that have already violated every principle of fair legal process. By May of 1693, the last prisoners have been released, many after paying substantial sums for room and board during months of incarceration for crimes they did not commit. The witch trials are officially over, but their impact on Salem Village and Massachusetts Bay Colony will endure for generations, leaving scars in the community consciousness that time alone will never fully heal. The physical landscape of Salem bears witness to the tragedy that has unfolded within its boundaries. Gallows Hill stands as a monument to judicial error and community hysteria, its rocky slopes forever marked by the memory of innocent blood shed in the name of protecting righteousness from supernatural assault. The houses where the accused once lived stand empty or occupied by new families who must live with the knowledge of what transpired within their walls. The graves of the executed witches, hastily dug and poorly marked, serve as silent testimony to a community's capacity for both great evil and eventual recognition of its errors. Some bodies were retrieved by families brave enough to claim them, while others lie in unmarked graves that speak to the complete social ostracism that accompanied conviction for supernatural crimes. The refusal to allow proper Christian burial for the condemned represents one final cruelty in proceedings that had already abandoned every principle of mercy and compassion. As winter settles over New England with its familiar embrace of cold and darkness, Salem Village begins the long process of healing from wounds that are both visible and invisible, both individual and collective. The community that had once prided itself on godliness and proper order must now confront the reality that it has participated in one of the most shameful episodes in colonial American history. A tragedy that will forever mark their legacy and challenge their understanding of human nature and divine justice. The silence that descends upon Salem with the ending of the trials is not the peace of resolution, but the quiet of exhaustion and shame, the hushed atmosphere of a community that has awakened from a nightmare only to discover that the monsters were not supernatural beings lurking in the shadows, but ordinary human beings capable of extraordinary evil when fear conquers reason and passion overcomes justice. In that silence lies both the memory of what was lost and the hope of what might yet be learned from the terrible events that transformed a small Puritan village into a symbol of the dangers that await any society that abandons the principles of evidence, mercy, and human dignity in pursuit of perfect security and absolute righteousness. And as the last candle fades in Salem, only the quiet lesson remains, that fear can sleep within us all, waiting for a whisper to awaken it. Thank you for listening, and good night.